Right guys, we're going to be doing a podcast on question 1 on diffusion. As we do this, we're listening to Clair de Lune by Debussy, and I want you to imagine those particles just slowly drifting down a concentration gradient, because that's what diffusion is. We go from an area of high concentration, spreading out, to an area of low concentration. My wife is laughing at me now. Anyway, so look at question 1. We can actually see the high concentration of particles outside the cell there. And immediately, once we identify a diffusion question, we've got to be thinking about where the gradient is. Remember, a gradient is just like a hill, and just like putting a car with the handbrake off on a hill, it will go down. And that's what the particles do. So, question 1, use words from the box to name the structures labelled A and B. So this is combining cells. Now immediately we should be thinking this is an animal cell because there's no fixed shape. And we can see that therefore B is definitely a cell membrane because it's the outer layer of an animal cell. A is going to be the nucleus. So hopefully quite straightforward there. 2. The cell in the diagram is an animal cell. How can you tell it is an animal cell and not a plant cell? Give 2 reasons. Well, I've talked about the fixed shape, and this is going to be about the organelles that are not there in animal cells that are there in plant cells. So, if we do take the difference between animal and plant cell, if I draw a plant cell here, we know it's going to look a bit more boxy. It's going to have a cell wall on the outside, and then it's going to have, just as a revision, which I know you know, lots of little green chloroplasts. It's going to have a nucleus, but in the plant cell we tend to draw the nucleus as a smaller entity, not necessarily in the middle like in the plant cell, sorry, in the animal cell, because in fact we're going to have, just so this is a slightly different colour, a vacuole, a permanent vacuole, which takes up a lot of the cell and holds water and a cell sap. So the shape of the animal cell is going to be different from the plant cell, and what we can say is, looking at this, we would have evidence of a cell wall, chloroplasts, and a permanent vacuole. Please remember, if I was to write chloro here, and I was to use vacuole, remember me writing this permanent vacuole. Permanent. Some animal cells do have tiny little vacuoles, and permanent is a really good way of making sure that you can distinguish between a plant and animal cell. So, that is a recap on cell structure. Now you should know this inside out. The difference between a plant and animal cell, those 3 things. Cell wall, permanent vacuole, and chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are where photosynthesis happens, and they are green because they contain chlorophyll. Animal cells, as you know, do not photosynthesize. One thing to mention actually is that you might get a situation, let me rub this out, you might have seen questions in the past where you get a cell looking like this, a plant cell, and once again it's got a membrane inside the cell wall. You should know that that's a root hair cell. There will not be any chloroplasts in there. Chloroplasts need sunlight. Chlorophyll needs sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. And as there's no sunlight, because you've got the soil up here, the root hair cells will not have any chloroplasts. Okay, that's just one thing to remember. So, moving on to section B, oxygen will diffuse into the cell. Why? Now, listen to that music. The oxygen is going to diffuse from an area of high concentration out here. You can just see so many more of them in a given space, and it's going to come in across the membrane and is going to go into the cell from an area of high concentration to low concentration down a concentration gradient. Okay, so that is the definition of diffusion: particles moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration down a concentration gradient, and that happens with oxygen, it happens to glucose, and in fact happens anywhere where the particles are able to move. And the animal cell and the plant cell are what we call permeable to oxygen and glucose, and therefore it's able to go down its concentration gradient. Okay, so last question on here. The cell shown in the diagram is usually found with similar cells. Drawing a ring around the correct answer to complete the sentence. Scientists call a group of similar cells, and you should know that this is a tissue. Now, I talked about using mark schemes. How can we use a mark scheme to check our knowledge here and work out what we can use this for in the future? Well, this question here has asked you to determine what a group of similar cells is called. And they've said, they've given you an option of an organ, a system, a tissue. The answer is tissue, so you can use this to see that the board's definition of a tissue, if they asked it the other way around and said, what is a tissue? You can say it's a group of similar cells. So if we go to their mark scheme here, we can just double check our answers from before. So A, nucleus, B, cell membrane. The differences between plant and animal cells is no cell wall, no large or permanent vacuole, remember that word, permanent vacuole, and no chloroplasts or chlorophyll. Talk about the diffusion from high to low oxygen concentration or down a gradient. It says do not accept, ignore along a gradient or across a gradient. It's down a gradient. You go down a hill. You don't go across a hill or along a hill. And as I said, this is a tissue. So from this we can learn, probably the most important thing to learn is what they won't accept for what the process of diffusion is, about here, about along or across, and also that there's three differences between a plant and animal cell according to the board, and remember that word permanent. So that is question 1 of that paper.